Hello, I'm Kim Gallen, and I'm with the Black Press Research Collective, and I'm really happy today to have Dr. Jane Rhodes here with me to speak about her work on the Black Press and some other issues involved in researching the Black Press. Dr. Rhodes is a dean for the study of race and ethnicity and a professor and chair of American Studies at Macalester College. She earned her BS and MA degrees from Syracuse University and her PhD from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She specializes in the study of race, gender, and mass media, the Black press, and social movements. Her first book, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, The Black Press and Protest in the 19th Century, and was published by Indiana University Press, was also named the best book in media communication history by the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. Her most recent book, Framing the Black Panther, The Spectacular Rise of a Black Power Icon, was published by the New Press in 2007. She's also was featured in the award-winning documentary Black Press, Soldiers Without Swords, and she's been the recipient of a President's Postdoctoral Fellowship from the University of California, a Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship, and a Research Fellowship from the University of London. You can also find many of her works in journals and edited book collections. And I'm really happy today to welcome Jane to the Black Press Research Collective to talk about Black newspapers. Hi, Jane. How are you?
I am great, Kim. It's good to be here.
Good, good. I want to get started with talking about your interest in the Black press, and particularly your first book on Mary Ann Shadd Cary. And how you came to research in the Black press, and why was that a point of interest for you, not only in your work in graduate school, but as you started and developed yourself as a scholar?
Okay, well, I had a very sort of circuitous academic career. It's not the conventional. I started off this research because I worked as a journalist for a number of years. So after I earned a master's in journalism and communications at Syracuse, I was a newspaper reporter. And that's really what was the sort of foundational catalyst for my research. In part, that was a catalyst because I did some research about the experiences of Black women journalists for my master's. But a lot of it was being on the ground, being a reporter, realizing that there was virtually no sort of understanding or knowledge or foundational history of the Black press, and particularly of African American women in the Black press. So here I was, a Black woman journalist, and there was no recognition that there was a history, that there was a lineage of my own sort of professional trajectory. So when I went to the PhD program at Chapel Hill, I went there with the explicit goal of wanting to sort of develop that historical lineage. Along the way, I encountered a number of people who provided me with inspiration to study Mary Ann Shadd Cary. One of those was the great historian and scholar Manning Marable. I actually met Manning at a workshop before I started my doctoral work, and I told him what I was interested in, that I really wanted to sort of uncover the legacy of Black women in journalism. And he said, well, have you ever heard of Mary Ann Shadd? And I said, no. And I thought that was indicative, because here I was trying to sort of find these foremothers, and I didn't even know that she existed. And he pointed me to Gerda Lerner's Black Women's History anthology, which was really one of the early sources then. This was in the 1980s. And he said, and in classic fashion, the Manning Marable fashion of activists, he said, well, sister, you better get in there, you better do this work, you better find out what this history is. And so I took that challenge from Manning, and I started my dissertation work on Mary Ann Shadd. So that's really how it started. And I was intrigued by the fact that she was this sort of foundational figure in 19th century African American history, but there was virtually nothing written about her when I started my work. Interestingly, as I worked on the dissertation, and then after the dissertation, there began to be a slow upwell of interest in Mary Ann Shadd, particularly by folks in Canada who were also trying to sort of resurrect her as founder of the Black Canadian community. So anyway, that was the catalyst for doing the work on Marianne Shedd. And then as I became trained as a scholar, I engaged with it through the lens of feminist history, African American history, and journalism history. So the project was very much at the intersection of those three sort of scholarly sort of enterprises. And I moved from the notion of simply thinking about this as a compensatory history, if you want to go back to Gerda Lerner again, you know, it became more than simply being interested in resurrecting her and mapping her name onto the history of journalism. And it became much more about the sort of dialogic relationship between print culture and Black activism and the life of this individual who was injecting a very, I think, advanced kind of feminist consciousness into the Black community. So that project also really got me thinking about African American activism and resistance of social movements, and how the Black press was sort of vital to that.
Mm-hmm. So don't laugh when you say this. I don't think I knew that you were a former journalist. And I think the reason why, and I might get sort of criticized for this statement from former journalists, is that you don't write like a former journalist, in that sense that it's been my experience that former journalists who write about journalism history write about it in a particular sort of way. And you write from you use the newspapers, and write about newspapers, but you also use them as a lens for understanding much larger social issues, right? And
Right.
it's my experience that former journalists are a little bit more tied to the newspapers themselves. So that's why I said you don't write like a former journalist. But I don't think I didn't know that you were a former journalist.
Yeah. Well, that's a part of my past that's pretty far back now. I was a reporter in the 1980s. You know, when I look at, you know, the sort of rapid transformation of print journalism today, and I think, you know, we couldn't have even imagined that when I was a newspaper reporter. So it was a long time ago. But I think you're right. I mean, part of what happened to me is my development as a scholar in graduate school, in which I became far less interested in simply mapping out a kind of journalism, you know, lineage, which is, I think, what a lot of journalists do, and former journalists do. And I'm very much an African Americanist, and I think I sort of fashion myself as that. So my work is very much grounded in the larger sort of trajectory of African American history, right? And the relationship between Black print culture and African American history. I do joke with folks to say that the one thing that being a journalist did in helping me with my scholarship is that it made me much more comfortable with writing. Okay. So I do think that along the way, the skills that I got in terms of storytelling stayed with me. So I think, you know, being a journalist did really help me to develop that. Excuse me a sec. So, but anyway, I think that the project on Marianne Shedd was very much a catalyst that moved me on to the next project on the Black Panthers, because I was very interested in resistance, Black political culture, African American history, the formation of gender within African American social movements. I think all of those questions come out of studying the Black press.
So I read that you read every article that was printed about the Black Panther Party in your research on the book on the Black Panthers. Is that true? And can you talk about how you use both sort of the mainstream, i.e. white press, and then the Black press in terms of your approach in using that to sort of map out how the Black Panther Party framed itself and was framed by mass media?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to say I read 100% of what was published, but I read a significant amount of it. One of the things that brought me to the project on the Black Panthers was that I grew up during the era of the Panthers. I knew people who were Panthers. And in the 90s, the Panthers sort of came back in black popular culture and also national culture in a variety of ways. And I was really fascinated by that phenomenon. What was it that kept the Black Panther Party so present in popular consciousness, right? So that whether they were being adopted by Public Enemy and hip hop, whether it was the film Panther that came out, whether it was the sort of uh, indictments of the Panthers that I kept seeing emerging in the mass press. And as a media scholar, one of the things that made it clear to me was that it had to have something to do with the media presence of the Black Panther Party during their own moment, during the 1960s and 70s, that sort of instantiated them within the sort of national culture and made them iconic in certain ways, and very different, because we know, for those of us who study black social movements, we know that there were many organizations. The Black Panthers were certainly not the only, and there are a lot of debates among African Americanists that I think are quite legitimate about whether the Black Panthers really deserve the attention that they've gotten, what was their lasting legacy, and so forth. So I was interested in the sort of that iconicity of the Panthers, and I traced that back to the media. So in order to sort of figure that out, I needed to really survey the universe of media coverage. Now, I narrowed it because I'd still be here today working on that book if I tried to look at everything, right? So I looked at the origins of the Panthers in California, in the Bay Area, and then going to Southern California, and I really focused on the news media in the San Francisco Bay Area, but then also sort of comparing that to their emergence as media subjects in national media, so the New York Times and the news magazines, and then television, and sort of watching the sort of roll out of the Black Panthers as these sort of symbols of black militancy and how that resonated in the media. So I didn't certainly look at every newspaper article that was published by about the Black Panthers, but I was very interested, again, in the dialogue, because I think one of the things that happens in the black experience broadly across history is that there's always a dialogue between sort of the discourses that African Americans produce and how they circulate in print culture, and then how they get taken up by dominant culture and sort of reformulated and reinscribed, often to the detriment of the original sort of African American project. So this was true in the 19th century, and I think the Panthers is an example of how this operates in the 20th century. So I was interested in not only the coverage of the Panthers by the dominant media, but the Panthers' own creation of their own sort of mediated communication. So the Black Panther newspaper, the other ways in which they injected themselves into public discourse. And then I was also interested in the black press, right? And sort of looking at the role of the black press in narrating the Panthers and comparing that to dominant culture. So I had, it was an ambitious project. It was, a complicated project, but it made a lot of sense to me to see the ways in which all of these different mediated forms, coming from very different sort of political projects, it created a sort of discursive universe about the Black Panther Party.
So, I mean, I've asked other scholars who work on the black press this question, and I think you would know best if I'm a little off in this. But I still think that the black press is understudied it's used by everyone that I know who is doing any sort of research historically about black people and the black experience, right? Everyone knows to go and look at the black press when they want to find information or evidence to make a particular argument. But still, it seems to be underanalyzed as a discourse or as a producer of discourse about black people, right?
Yeah.
And you obviously use it in that sort of way, but why does it seem as though that seems to be escaping people's attention? I know what I know under sort of sells or estimates the importance of the black press, but it still seems to be underanalyzed as an institution, as a producer of discourse about the black experience, and not only that, about the experience of race and in the United States.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, which is why I'm so excited about this project, because um, I think there are a variety of reasons. I think part of the advantage that I have being trained as a media historian is to understand in a deeper way, perhaps, the sort of salience of media and print culture in the formation of ideology and political practices and social practices and cultural practices. And I think very often people who are trained in the disciplines simply see the black press and print culture more broadly as a source. It's an archive, right? But it doesn't in and of itself necessarily have meaning. It's a vehicle to the meaning. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why the black press gets understudied, because it's seen as you suggest, a resource on black communities or on black ideas, but it's not seen in and of itself as having power, of having a sort of deeper meaning, right? And I think that is missing this enormous sort of institution that has had a kind of influence on black political, cultural, social, intellectual life since the black press started in the 19th century. And I think, that's one of the reasons why the black press is still salient today. In a historical moment when people don't read newspapers, when they're signaling the death knell of virtually every print medium, African American newspapers still survive, right? And still have salience, whether or not they're on digital platforms or not. And I think that's because it is not simply a vehicle for a particular kind of content, whether it's news content or political content, but the institution itself has a great amount of power in the African American community.
So 15 years ago, about 15 years ago, Stanley Nelson came out with Soldiers Without Swords, and I still think most people teaching about the black press use that documentary. I don't know if there's anything that's been done that rivals that, and you were featured in the documentary talking about your work. If one were to produce a documentary now on the black press or the history of the black press, I'm interested in knowing what you think would be the focus of it. I mean, Stanley Nelson did a really good job of tracing out, the black press and the tradition of it. But, what would a film look like today that looked at black newspapers either historically or contemporarily?
That's a great question, and I think that there could definitely be a black press part 2. I think one of the reasons why Stanley's film was so successful is because he's such a skillful filmmaker and storyteller, right? But I think that, and I think that one of the things that's so interesting and important about that film is that he's really one of the few sort of public historians who recognized how central the black press was to all of these different sort of historical moments and trajectories, and he selected some key stories like Charlotta Bass and the California Eagle and the Pittsburgh Courier and the Double V campaign to open up these much larger questions, right, about black communities and about black history. If you were to look at it today, it seems to me that it would be fascinating to look at this whole question that I just raised about the continued sort of vitality and salience of black press. Why does it remain and sustain itself in ways that sort of mainstream press does not? Why does it still have an audience and a public? I think it's much more on a digital platform. The growth of black print culture and as newspapers in digital form is phenomenal, and it's really powerful, and I think that's very much in the tradition of the black press also. So I could imagine a black press part 2 that really looks at both the sort of traditional newspapers that are still around, that still have an audience. For an example, I live in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul. That has a relatively small African American population. It's only about 6% of the population. These are small cities. There are 2 black newspapers that are published here that are still, thriving. One of the things that those papers have done to sort of sustain their audience is to embrace sort of new black communities, primarily African immigrant communities. Um, and so it seems to me that if small cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul can sustain black newspapers, and there was a history, if you go back, there have been as many as 13 black newspapers that were published in this region.
Wow.
Most people don't even think there are black people who live there, right? So I think that's a story to be told also. You can go to small communities across America, and you can find these really fascinating, idiosyncratic African American media. And I think sort of looking at, because Stanley really ends his film in the 1960s, and I think picking that up, the role of the black press since the 60s, and it's not to say that black newspapers haven't run into the same kind of financial difficulties as dominant press, but they continue to play a significantly different role.
Yeah, what's so funny about that? This just occurred to me. Black newspapers have always struggled to maintain themselves, right? Never could get the advertising that their white counterparts could. Yeah. There's no way that the black press in the late 20th, 21st century has the history and the tradition of having to sustain itself on very little that may allow these newspapers to be really creative about maintaining themselves when other papers have not had that tradition.
Right. They're very often efforts of love and commitment, right? Yes. And it's not to say that they're not also commercial enterprises. At one time, Johnson Publishing or the Chicago Defender made a lot of money, and as the media landscape changes, that is likely to change. But I think that there is an interesting tradition in African American communities about the resonance of black print culture.
So I'm curious, this is almost I want you to give us a little preview of what you're working on. The black press and newspapers and media has been such a sort of cornerstone of your research. Will it continue to be, and can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Sure. I mean, I've got lots of projects in various stages of unfinishedness. They're hopefully to come. There are all of these black newspapers and other media outlets that continue to be really understudied. I'm very interested right now in sort of early 20th century. A lot has been done on the Chicago Defender and Robert Abbott. I understand there's a new biography about to come out about Robert Abbott, but there's been much less written about some of the radical black newspapers. I'm thinking of The Messenger, A. Philip Randolph's Messenger, of The Negro World, published by Marcus Garvey, and so forth. So I've been very interested because I'm interested in that historical moment right now for a variety of research purposes. So I'm very interested in those. What I'm trying to develop is a book, a series of essays that's tentatively titled something like Revisiting the Black Public Sphere. Because when there was that wonderful anthology, The Black Public Sphere, that came out about a decade ago, that was published by the journal Public Culture, and it was a wonderful series of essays by prominent African American scholars who were trying to sort of locate what we understand to be the black public sphere in all kinds of spaces, in music, in political protest, in sort of black politics. People like Michael Dawson wrote these really powerful essays. One of the things that I found troubling in looking at that original collection and discussions about the black public sphere since is the erasure of the black press. Right? So, while and I think that the black press still remains a crucial sort of location for the black public sphere, and is often the place that the black public sphere is launched, right? Even if it goes into sort of other locations and domains. So I want to bring the notion of the black public sphere back to media, in particular, to look at the black press. I'm also interested in other media forms, and to sort of interrogate that concept a bit more deeply. So that's what I'm working on right now.
I love that idea, Jane, as you might imagine. That's excellent. And I'm dying to talk to you off camera about that, and I will definitely. But that sounds like a fascinating project. I don't want to hold up any more of your time, but thank you so much for being here today and hanging out and talking about the Black Press. I'm looking forward to your work coming out really soon, and would recommend that everyone go back to the first book as well as the Black Panther book if you're looking for ways to think about how to use the Black Press and then the Black Press as a producer and discourse.
Well, thank you, Kim. I appreciate all of the support, and thank you for being the catalyst for this project on a digital history of the Black Press. It is long overdue, and it's really exciting that this is happening.
All right, thanks. Have a good day.
Okay, bye-bye.